Welcome everyone to this webinar. This webinar is organized by the Center for Autism and Theology, formerly the Center for the Study of Autism and Christian Community. Before I introduce our speaker, Professor Daniel Bowman, let me briefly introduce the center to you. The Center for Autism and Theology was launched in 2018 by Professor Grant McCaskill here at the University of Aberdeen and some other colleagues in the same department of Divinity and Religious Studies. The center aims to host interdisciplinary research into autism in relation to theology, faith, and church. As such, we hope that the center can function as a hub that brings together all those interested in that intersection of autism and theology, and faith and church. And in this way, we hope to contribute to the academic world, but also to be of service to the church and other faith communities. As part of our activities, we organize 2 webinars each teaching term, so that's 4 times a year. So do look at our website to see more details and how you might get involved with the center if that's of interest to you. And of course, you can follow us on social media. So it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Daniel Bowman to you. Dan is a poet, he is a novelist, and he is an associate professor of English at Taylor University. He is editor-in-chief of Relief, a journal of art and faith, and faculty advisor to students for Education on Neurodiversity, SEND for short. Some of you might have come across his book On the Spectrum, Autism, Faith and the Gifts of Neurodiversity, which was published last year. And for those of you who haven't read the book yet, I can wholeheartedly recommend the book. It's really great read. And I'm delighted then to have you here with us. We are delighted and that you will be reading from your book today and answer questions and comments. So then we'll talk about his book with us today, about autism, about faith, for about 30 to 40 minutes. And after that, we will have a short break, a couple of minutes. And then during the break and after that, you can type your questions and comments in the chat box. And then we will have a time of Q&A. This will be moderated by Hannah Kundell and myself. And I think that's the outline for today. Yes, that's it. So then we're delighted that you are with us today, and we look forward to what you have to say to us. Over to you.
There, I think I'm unmuted now. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. And so, yeah, I want to start with a reading in just a minute. But I wanted to begin with this quote from a favorite writer of mine named Marilyn McIntyre, who is out in California, because she helps me forge a relationship between creative writing and literature and storytelling and faith. And since I am not a theologian or a scholar or a disability scholar or autism scholar or anything like that, I'm a creative writer. I wanted to kind of set the table a little bit for the reading with this quote. So McIntyre in her book, Caring for Words in a Culture of Lies, she writes, "The church needs to be a place where stories are read." And already for me, that's a really intriguing claim because I wasn't brought up that way. I was brought up in a church that was largely suspicious of many different types of stories. And so that really captured my imagination years ago and still does. The church needs to be a place where stories are read. We need good storytellers to keep us alive and imagining. The exercise of the imagination is the training ground for compassion. Stories educate the heart. They call forth and focus our dread and desire. They're vehicles of confession, thanksgiving, and petition. And so that really helps me understand. I just love this argument that that we need storytellers to keep us alive and imagining, and that the exercise of the imagination is in fact the training ground for compassion. I find that really interesting. So if we're followers of Christ and we want to be compassionate people and learn to love our neighbors better, one avenue that would help us with that is to read and write stories. And so that's really why I'm here today, is more as a storyteller. And this book is a memoir, so I also don't want anybody to be surprised if you pick up the book. It's not a theology of disability or any of those kinds of things, and it's certainly not scholarly. It's a memoir in essays, and it's just stories from my own life, trying to, I suppose, make meaning of experience, but in some ways also, and many autistic people can identify with this and relate to this, it's a kind of letting go of a lot of the shame that I carried, especially before I was diagnosed as autistic, and trying to understand who I am and what makes me tick, and also that it's okay, it's by design, and it's not that my autism is not a bug in the system. It's actually the operating system itself. It's a feature. And so learning to make that paradigm shift through storytelling is really, really important to me. And so without much more introduction, I would love to just jump into the story and read from the opening section of the book, if that's okay. So this is the prelude at the very outset of the book. And there are several epigraphs that I begin with. There's a long one. I don't think I'll read that, but I'll read the shorter one by a writer named Virginia Stem Owens. And she says, "As we shape our stories, we shape ourselves." October 2019. The last suitcase has been packed into the car. The odometer on our 2006 Honda shows nearly 300,000 miles, but we trust it as much as ever. It took us safely to Sarasota, Atlanta, Charleston, Baltimore, New York, and back home again just a few months ago. This trip, Beth and the kids are visiting our friends who moved to North Carolina after 8 years here in Indiana. 8 years of developing the most cherished relationship we've ever known as a family. I ache to see our friends too, but my fall break at the university does not come for a few more weeks, so I must stay home. I'm sitting at our dining room table in my usual seat. The house looks different when I'm about to be alone. Details suddenly jump out at me. The original oak framework on the pocket doors, the 1950s rose vine wallpaper, the 1930s Wurlitzer our daughter Una plays every day. I like telling people, especially my English majors, that the house was built in 1890, the same summer that Oscar Wilde's masterpiece, The Picture of Dorian Gray, was published in Lippincott's monthly magazine. The romance of this knowledge is lost in life's dailiness, running Una to play rehearsals and jazz band, or Casey to robotics club, Beth's baking bread or writing poems, my grading another freshman essay that begins with, "In society today." But just now the house and its history feel important. They crystallize in the shadow of a coming loneliness. I try to thwart the melancholy with an ambitious mental list of things I'll do this week. Certainly I'll catch up on schoolwork. I can probably finish the new Ta-Nehisi Coates book. I need to call my mom, and it wouldn't hurt to jog a few miles. In reality, I'll clean the house obsessively to exert maximum control over my environment. I'll somehow fall further behind on schoolwork because I always do. I will put off phone calls and texts as they'll sometimes feel unbearable. An indiscriminate number of episodes of shows Beth doesn't care for, spy thrillers, science fiction, will form the backdrop of my evenings. I'll stay up too late staring into screens with near absolute lack of purpose, counting down the hours until I'm no longer alone. Every day of the week, I'll remind myself over and over that this leaving is okay. This one is good and right and temporary, and I don't need to be afraid. Yet my body won't respond to reason. It has a memory of its own. This is not like that other leaving I tell myself, the memory of which makes the back of my neck go cold. As if reading my mind, Beth puts her hand on my shoulder. She's cautious, but I also detect a playful warmth. Love you, she says. It sends me. It always has. It doesn't come a lot. At times it has stopped coming altogether. Sometimes in its place is its ugly opposite, accompanied once by a household object zipping past my ear. The memories give me pause. I've deserved it if anyone has. I've caused pain. What's more, I've caused trauma. I never meant to, but as the Mills Brothers sang in 1944, you always hurt the ones you love. And there's dark, knotty truth in that. There's a particularly autistic way this hurting can happen, inadvertently mostly, by virtue of the fact that what autistics need so deeply just to function from moment to moment seems often to run counter to what people need from us. Maybe we need structure and predictability at the very time that people in our lives need whim or impulse. Maybe we need to be alone when they long for companionship. Maybe our senses are overloaded when theirs are underwhelmed. It can seem like we're acting unkindly or worse, though almost always we're just trying to survive in a world that was not made for us. Of course, before you have a diagnosis, you don't know any of this. You can't. The story you tell yourself about yourself, the story that shapes you, is that you're not normal, that you're a bad human being, a lousy friend, a bad husband, even a bad parent. You think you're letting everyone down, that maybe the people in your life would be better off without you. For those of us who follow Christ, we believe we're doing that badly too. The pursuit that informs all others. We're laying waste to a witness in the world. We ask God, where are you? We live with intense guilt and shame. One study of autistic adults released by Anglia Ruskin University in Cambridge confirms, quote, Dr. Stephen Stagg, senior lecturer in psychology, said, one aspect of the research I found heart-wrenching was that the participants had grown up believing they were bad people. They referred to themselves as alien and non-human. The study also says that many of us are treated for depression. Other studies show that the suicide rate for autistic people is nearly 10 times higher than that of our non-autistic peers, and that the average life expectancy of the autistic person is just 36 years. As the hugs end, the car doors close, and the engine starts, my wife and our children drive away. I'm alone now, trying not to remember that other leaving, the one that would change everything, that would set me on a path toward answers I didn't know existed. And now I flash back to November of 2014. I'm sitting on the edge of the bed in a dimly lit second-floor hotel room on Sanibel Island, Florida. I'm here for a writers' conference. I've come mostly to meet Richard Russo, Pulitzer Prize winner and hero to literary-minded central New Yorkers like me. Russo grew up just a few exits down the thruway from mine. His first novel even bears the name of my hometown, Mohawk. Mohawk is Beth's hometown too. Her parents still live there in the same church, in the same house on Church Street where she grew up. The house where she and our two kids are staying right now, have been staying since she left our home, left Indiana, left me. We had a fight on our way to the Indianapolis airport. I had experienced what I would later call an extreme autistic meltdown. But at the time, neither of us truly knew what had happened or why, and both of us were devastated. Because I was the one channeling the demons, I would need to accept the blame. I would need to be left. You have heard it said that anger is fear's bodyguard. But I say to you that anger is fear's body double. It's evil twin. They dress in each other's clothes. No one can distinguish between them. penetrate the veneer to understand the primal reactions beneath the surface. No one knows there is a veneer. At its best or worst, the ruse is complete, the power absolute. If I'm talking in abstractions, it's for at least two reasons. One, I still don't understand the outright terror that exists for me in meltdowns. I don't really know how to talk about them, and I'm a little scared to, as though I might somehow afford them even more influence. I know that's absurd, but my meltdowns have threatened to undo me. In them, I've seen hell. Two, the nature of meltdowns is as close to an out-of-body experience as I've had. I honestly don't remember the details after. They seem to be a last resort regulatory mechanism, a shocking reset button for the nerve endings. When I come to, I'm prickly, rumpled, dazed. Autistic writer Ashley McKay describes her meltdowns as, quote, emotional avalanches, saying, quote, they can happen at any time and can be caused by a number of factors, including environmental stimuli, stress, uncertainty, rapid and impactful change, and more. She talks about her heart pounding, throat drying up, tears falling, senses blasting, the room spinning. Caleb Johnson, describing what happens after the onslaught of unwanted input, simply says, sometimes I pass out. My brain gives up trying to fight. Suffice it to say, these are punishing events and we don't have control over them. But again, how could anyone expect to know what's unfolding when you don't know you're autistic? Back to thinking you're a horrible person, some sort of insane loose cannon. Back to depression, back to suicidal ideation. Which brings me back to the dimly lit hotel room on Sanibel Island. It is the worst day of my life. I'm positive I cannot live without Beth and our two beautiful children. The only thing on my mind is quitting this life. I plan to get up from the bed, walk across the patio, past the perky orange lounge chairs with drink holders, to the water's edge, and enter the Gulf of Mexico until the salt water fills my lungs, claims me, ends me. I don't want to write this down, now or ever. This is a story I want to tell that I don't want to tell myself or anyone else. I want to protect my kids from it, whatever that might mean. But I need to tell the truth. So if someday people do read this account, I'll trust them to feel their feelings, to come to terms with those realities, to mourn my past, their past, as I have. It's awful, and there's no way around it but through it. I want to walk to the water, but my body's frozen to the hotel bed. I sit motionless for well over an hour. I move only to turn off the light and lie down. When I sleep, I do not dream. Earlier in the day, I decided to go to the opening session of the conference. After all, it was why I came. A well-known writer spoke about some element of storytelling, I suppose. I didn't hear a word because I sat apart from everyone and listened through earbuds on full volume to a recording of a honey-voiced therapist talking through deep breathing exercises. The recording had come preloaded on a tiny black MP3 player a counselor on my campus had given to me some months before as he ushered me kindly out the door. I'd been more depressed than usual, and so he'd agreed to let me stop in and see if he could make a referral. His job included triage for anyone, faculty, staff, students, but long-term treatment was for students only. So I jammed the MP3 player into the bottom of my backpack and thought nothing of it until my plane landed in Florida, and somehow it popped into my mind. I checked to see if it was still there. Of course it was. I never clean out my backpack. I don't know if the breathing exercises worked, but I did them religiously because I couldn't think of anything else to do to not die. So in that sense, I guess they did work. Why wouldn't my body move toward the sea that night? I'd rehearsed the act in my mind. nothing would have stopped me from carrying it out. I knew not a soul on the entire island. I was a perfect stranger to everyone at the conference and the hotel. It was dark and the beach was empty. It would have been easy. My body wouldn't cooperate. Something stopped it from happening. Was it merely the inexorable pull of doing stuff? Setting an alarm, getting up in the morning, dutifully attending sessions at the conference, eating, brushing my teeth? Was it just my autistic need for structure, routine, control? Did I make a choice, conscious or otherwise, to live? Did God save me? I don't know. I lived. In a few days, I came home. And a few weeks later, Beth and the kids came home. Though there'd be much work ahead of us, it was the best day of my life. I'll stop there from the prelude and maybe talk through that just for a second, and then I was going to maybe read a tiny bit more from a different section of the book. But you know, it was really important to me at the very outset of the book. I knew there were going to be a lot of essays about a lot of different events and covering different topics and things. I go back to my childhood and so forth, but I wanted to start in crisis because it seemed to me to be the springboard into everything that happened afterward. I go into the story in that very prelude of the diagnostic process that I underwent, and that took a very, very long time, and that was filled with all kinds of misstarts and therapists that weren't a great fit for me, or I wasn't a great fit for them, and so forth. And so everything that happened in that little section that I read just now sort of made me understand that I needed to know who I was at a much deeper level. And that always feels ironic to me, because I thought I was self-aware. I'd been going to counseling and spiritual direction and doing spiritual reading for years and lots of other things, you know, reading and teaching storytelling and trying to understand character development. I thought I knew who I was, but the word autism never crossed my mind until I was in crisis in my personal life. And then that led me to begin this journey. And so throughout the rest of the book, I discuss different parts of that journey and tell different stories, like I said, from growing up in the Mohawk River Valley in upstate New York to coming out here to the Midwest to teach, and even now kind of turning the tables a little bit and working with autistic students. So after I sort of got my own house in order, as it were, I'm able to mentor, you know, college kids on the spectrum, and that's very powerful and wonderful. So I think my trajectory has been sort of the wounded healer narrative, you know. Henry Nouwen and other writers talk about this, but I think if I'm not mistaken, I'm out of my depth, but it goes back to like Jungian psychology, that where your greatest pain resides is where perhaps your greatest blessing could come from. And so I wanted to share that pain and be really open about it, so that I could start the process of healing and perhaps even be available to heal others. I had another little section marked, if it's okay to read from. I think, yeah, I'll keep it really quick. I'm only going to read maybe a page or a page and a half from this, but this is Autism in Church. And so this is where I get into a little bit more about my experience later when I understood who I was and I had diagnosis, and I've done so much reading about autism and so much more living with it. Then I could understand better all facets of my life, including worship. And so I want to read just a little bit of that. So this also has an epigraph or quote at the beginning of the chapter. I guess I'll read that one. It's from a writer named Madeline Ryan, and an essay that she wrote called "I'm Autistic, Here's How to Be Friends with Me." And the quote goes like this: "There's nothing I love more than a ritual, except maybe a routine. The safety of rituals and routines cannot be overstated. Through establishing a pattern, I can relax. It's coffee at the cafe I know well, or dinner and drinks at your house, or going to the movies, whatever. Every autistic person's different, obviously. Yet in my world, I know that there will be no, quote, popping over for tea unannounced, or insisting that we go somewhere else just as we sat down, or throwing unexpected guests into the mix. And that's the end of the quote. I appreciate what she's saying because these are real needs. These are real adaptations and strategies for autistic people. And yet, when you go to church, you can't control any of this stuff. There are going to be guests that are unannounced. There are going to be small children screaming. There's going to be all kinds of things happening that you can't control. And so I really was trying to figure out, and I suppose I still am in a certain way. How does the autistic life fit with the church life and with the life of the faith community? So I'm just going to read a little bit of this. There are a couple of vignettes, so it's going to sound somewhat broken up. It's not really a fluid chronological narrative. They're just a couple of vignettes, so I'll pause in between them. Coffee hour after the service. Strangers smile wide, pump my hand, ask classic small talk questions that should be simple but aren't for me. Like, how are you? I don't know, and I'm not sure if they want a real answer. I tend to take things literally and overthink these exchanges. Would they like me to be real? Would it reflect better on who we are as a body of believers if I'm honest? Because frankly, I'm often not okay, and I wouldn't mind telling somebody. Or should I pretend everything's fine like most people do? If it were me visiting a church, I'd be put off if I got an inauthentic vibe. Then again, I'd be put off if it seemed like they were trying too hard. I once visited a church where people spoke in the worst evangelical cliches and then thanked one another for, quote, being so transparent. I feel the sweat on my forehead. I slurp my coffee too quickly, burning my tongue. The pastor suddenly issues a call to fill the front of the sanctuary after I've carefully selected the exact seat I need near the middle and on the aisle. Don't be shy, everyone, move up. Yes, that means you. Plenty of good seats up here. There's unwanted direct eye contact. Frozen with fear. We're doing popcorn prayer in my small group, and although they say you can, quote, pray as you feel led, the expectation is very clear. Everyone in the group must pray. The only one who hasn't offered up a petition because my selective mutism has decided to kick in. My senses are overloaded from the worship band's volume and intensity. Or I'm practicing in my head what to say, but I'm nervous and I know the words won't come out right. Or I'm afraid that my concerns, the confessions I want to offer up, are markedly different from those I've just heard, and so I better keep it simple. Anyone got a sick grandma? That's an easy one. Please toss me a softball and mention your sick grandma. Someone behind me touches me with no warning and begins praying into my ear. Their breath tingles my skin, which I'd crawl out of if I could. Others lay hands on me, on my sensitive neck, shoulders, and head, startling me, making me cringe, making me wish I'd stay home this morning. And so I hate to leave off on the bad part, so to speak. It ends up, getting resolved to some degree, I think. Yeah, church, is so many different things, but one thing it is certainly it's a kind of gamut of social rules and expectations, most of which are unwritten, especially if you've never been to a certain church before. And that leads to all kinds of challenges and difficulties for autistic people who want to attend worship and live and flourish within a Christian community. And so that's another thing that I bring up in the book, and that we can talk about if folks have questions. I think that's probably good for the reading, if that's good. And then are we about to take a break now? Is that right? Okay, excellent. I think we're going to take a quick break and then we'll come back. And what I'm here for is discussion. So I'd love to just have some good question and answer time. So thank you for letting me read, and we'll be back in just a minute.
Thank you so much, Dan. This is really wonderful. As Dan is saying, we are going to take a short break, just 2 minutes, 2 to 3 minutes for you to process what you've heard, and then you can start typing your questions in the Q&A box. Just one comment on that. This session is being recorded. We will not mention your names, just in terms of GDPR and all of that. But you also have the option to tick a box to say that you want to ask your question anonymously. So the way it works is you type your question and then Hannah will read them out and we will group them together in the background. So it's not like the first question comes first necessarily. We try to group them around certain themes if there are many questions. So let's have a 2 to 3 minute break and then we'll be back. Thank you.
Hi and welcome back, everyone. Thank you to those of you who've already put some questions into the chat, and I'm going to ask those of Dan now. I've also got a couple of questions of my own if we get time. So the first couple are related. One person asks, what recommendations do you have for church lay leaders wanting to make their church a more inclusive space for folks on the spectrum? And another person sort of echoes that and says, I loved your reading. I'm wondering how to help churches be aware of the sensory and other needs of people with autism, and speaks about giving people a space to escape even within a service. Do you have any ideas? So I'll start you off with that, Dan.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. Great questions. My go-to answer, I hope it doesn't sound like a cop-out. I don't have specific, plans drawn up for how to make any church building more accessible to autistic people or anything like that exactly. I have seen people who have had success with building, quiet rooms and things like that where the lights are dim. Most autistic people I know, including myself and a lot of my students, prefer not the harsh overhead lighting, but natural lighting, perhaps coming in a window or just table lamps, that sort of thing. That can help quite a bit. Depending on the type of church, if there's loud music playing, I have attended some large churches that have really loud music over the years. It's been a long time now, but I have. If you have one of those quieter rooms, you can pipe in the music at a lower volume, and that might be useful. I think, another thought that I've had, especially recently, is just giving autistic people and neurodivergent people the space to stim if they need to. And often that will look like a movement of the hands that may not be real comfortable for folks who aren't familiar with neurodivergence. And so just to have a sort of non-judgmental space where people of all ages, actually kids, sometimes you'll see kids on the spectrum wearing big ear defenders that have noise canceling properties, things like that. So those are some thoughts, but really the main thing that I would say, my main takeaway would be to read books by autistic people, to read blog posts, poems, stories by autistic people, and kind of just listen in to the contours of their everyday experiences as they're presented to you in storytelling. And so I believe so firmly in storytelling. That's how I started today. And then I think go from there. Listen to autistic people, let them lead, and go from there. I think a little bit of understanding and just the desire to want to help goes so far. Most of us who are on the spectrum have not been met halfway by folks. It's usually us doing a lot of the bending. And so when anyone even asks the question in good faith and says, what can we do to help you out? Or let's say you have a child on the spectrum in your family who's attending a church, what can we do? That's just such a wonderful opportunity to connect with people better. And I see it as being no different from a lot of things. If someone's a new immigrant from a different culture or something, if you want to show God's love to that person, you're going to need to get a little bit invested in who they are and how they function and what their background has been like, and just try to understand them better. So try to come to an understanding of autism and autistic people through reading our own narratives and listening. I think is probably the number one suggestion I have.
Super, thank you so much for that. And the next one it's kind of related and also not, because someone asks, how do you talk then to your university colleagues about autism in the classroom? So, in some ways there'll be some crossover, but I think there may be some differences there too.
Yeah, that's tough. I have a chapter, an essay in the book about when I sort of came out to my colleagues, to use that language. It's a tricky situation. I didn't know how it was going to go over. I had no, and that's the thing about this stuff is it's quite new, and I had no role models or examples to look to say, oh, this is how you handle neurodivergence in the academy. There was nothing there except, some books by Temple Grandin, and her life looks very, very different from mine. And so, yeah, I decided, because I'm a writer and a storyteller, I decided to write about it first. Fortunately for me, I had some colleagues who were, let's see, one of them was a fellow at which is a 3-year post at the Center for Teaching and Learning Excellence at my university. And so this is a center that focuses on helping faculty become better instructors. And he had read a couple of my essays that actually ended up in the book, but this was long before I had a book. And he had read them online at Ruminate magazine and said, wow, this is really compelling stuff. And I think it would be great for you to share this with our colleagues in a workshop type setting, you know. So I was able to do that, and it was a very tough day for me. I remember I was really, really nervous to do that because you don't know, you know, are people going to perceive me differently? Are people going to look at my teaching differently? Are they going to think that I am not qualified to do what I do, or that somebody else might be better, or something? I'm paranoid in general as it is. And so when I decided to relay this information to colleagues, including administrators and everybody else, it felt like a real risk actually to me and to my career. But you know what? The great thing is it was very well received. I was very much accepted. And it was empowering, you know. So to tell my story and to tell my truth was the shedding of that shame that I had felt for whatever miscommunications and misunderstandings that are typical with autism. If I read the room incorrectly, or if I read someone's humor incorrectly, or whatever, we carry around a lot of shame because we tend to bumble and stumble in the neurotypical world a lot of days. And so to share my story with my colleagues became empowering. As hard as it was at first, it became empowering. So I'll go back to that image that I mentioned earlier of the wounded healer. I'd been carrying around this wound, you know, for my whole life. I just didn't know what it was called, but it did have a name, and it did have a series of characteristics and traits associated with it. And when I shared it, it ultimately became empowering for me. So yeah, and it's still weird to talk about it in the academy at times, because I keep sort of almost apologetically saying that I'm not a theologian and I'm not a scholar. I really mean it. I'm not those things. And so a lot of folks in the academy expect those things. So when you show up for a panel on disability or anything like that, they expect you to use the scholarly language and to use theoretical frameworks that everyone's familiar with except me, because I'm not a scholar. So I go by way of storytelling and poetry and imagery and all that. And the good thing is, I think it can remind people that the Bible is actually largely just stories and narrative and poems. And so it's not just a rule book, you know, on how to live. It's a lot of narrative, and narrative takes investment emotionally, intellectually. You have to invest in those stories, and try to see yourself reflected in them and see where you can get better and all that kind of stuff. So long answer, but yeah, it's going well at school these days. And also I'll say one last thing, because I find this really exciting. I apologized to a student not too long ago for some little miscommunication, and I said, you know, I'm autistic. I can't always pick up on everything that's happening, and especially if I'm stressed, and you know, there are different factors at play. And what she said to me was so beautiful and so helpful to me. She said, you know, Professor Bowman, my generation, I think we're more accepting of neurodivergence than yours is. And so, you know what? We don't think this is a big deal at all. Like, it's cool. And I was so pleased and so thankful, because it's true. People my age and older, we didn't grow up with this in large part. We don't know a lot about it. And that generation's understanding on neurodivergence and neurodiversity, I think, much more openly, which is really cool.
That's super. A vote for young people there, which I'll take as well. Yeah. Not because I'm young, but because I care about young people. Well, we will follow your long answer with a long question. So forgive me the time it's going to take for me to read this out carefully. But there's some really interesting thoughts in here for you to reflect on. So our questioner says, thank you for your candor in the beginning when you described the struggle of not knowing yourself at a time you thought you knew yourself very well. In my experience, it is a function of being misunderstood or not known for so many years, starting from our earliest memories. that we find it safest to adopt the image of ourselves that others have given us, which is usually completely different from who we really are and what we really feel. It is so important to realize how this impacts our spiritual lives and our ability to relate to God. Because this takes place in the deep core of ourselves and we struggle, probably unconsciously, with how we show ourselves to God when we are alone with him. It becomes a dilemma. We ask ourselves, do we keep with the public image everyone has shaped, the one we are supposed to show, or do we reveal our true naked selves and take the chance of scaring ourselves with who we really are and scaring off God, who sees the duplicity and may not find our naked selves good enough? Have you confronted this in your spiritual life since the time you first realized that? And what has helped you shed the mask in front of God and your fellow worshippers? It's a very personal question, but I'm really interested to hear your thoughts, Dan.
Yeah, thanks for whoever wrote that. Is really lovely and articulate and elegant. Yeah, of course, it's kind of a core experience is when you decide, okay, what's the real me underneath this? What's the mask? How much am I willing to shed the mask in my daily life? In different communities and in different settings, it's always going to be different. I tend to hide behind the mask of academia sometimes, and so that feels appropriate to me if I'm in a faculty meeting, or like let's depersonalize it even more. If I'm in like a meeting with administrators for some long-term strategy session or something like that, I will probably have the mask on for the most part because I need to play a role and do those kinds of things. The real truest me, I kind of have a built-in advantage because I teach creative writing. And so in a roundabout way, I'll answer it like this. When you teach creative nonfiction, for example, you teach students that generally speaking, the best memoirs and the best personal essays are the ones where the writer tells on himself, where the writer takes a risk and is very vulnerable and says the thing, whatever the thing is. I just decided that the gold standard for me would say, take the worst, most humiliating moments of your life and front load them to the very beginning of the book. So if anyone thinks I'm playing games, they'll see right away, I'm not. This is real for me. And so I was able to shed the mask in that way. And I think that was empowering for me. And then when to go back to teaching creative writing, I teach them that and I say that to them. So how could I be so hypocritical as to not practice it myself in my own work? I shed that mask in my work. And then when people come to know me through the work, they know that real me. And I may mask up a little bit more if I don't know folks really well. But generally speaking, they know my core essential truths. And then I can go from there. I think the other thing is, too, I get the chance to mentor young people, which is really exciting. And I talk about it in the book a little bit. Some of them are autistic. I have this group called SEND, Students for Education on Neurodiversity, that meets on my campus. And I'm the faculty advisor to this group. So SEND meetings are also a sort of a group therapy at times, not always. Sometimes they're a little more formal and we have a presentation or reading or something like that. But a lot of times it's just us sitting around telling our stories. And I like to hear the stories from 19, 20-year-olds who grew up autistic in a different time from when I did. And I like to share my stories of my heartbreaks and my embarrassments and humiliations and my shame, put it all on the table and say, look, I functioned worse than you do. You seem to me to be smarter than I was when I was your age, and I somehow made it, and I'm somehow okay right now, and perhaps better than ever in terms of the freedom I feel with God and myself and my community, my faith community, and you can do it too. So I guess practicing, what I'm saying maybe is practicing telling your stories regularly and being brutally honest. I probably do it too much because I'm an artist. I'm too sensitive. I'm too into all that stuff. I go to counseling and I talk very openly. I talk openly with my students. I talk openly with friends. I write openly. If anything, I may need to pull back a little bit.
We hope you don't pull back. But staying with literature then, because you are a walking encyclopedia of writers and books and poems and things that have influenced you and have shaped you. And one questioner says, I really enjoyed reading about your enthusiasm for creative writing and literature in your book. I find that stories help me to reflect and explain how it feels to be autistic. And I was wondering if you have found the same, which of course you've shared a bit about. Are there any particular books and poems that you want to flag up that have helped you with this process?
I could do so well on that question if I had time to think through that more. Yes, certainly there's so many different books out there. I'll answer it a couple different ways, I guess. There are many, many books out there that are wonderful for this kind of stuff. I think I am super interested in autistic characters in popular culture and in media and entertainment. So when we're talking like digital or visual storytelling on television and in film and things like that, that's one thing. And I have a lot of thoughts on that. I think at least in the US, we're just, I don't know, maybe 10 or 15 years behind where books are in terms of good, authentic storytelling from the autistic point of view. Although there's some really good moments out there on television and in film. For books, I became fascinated with literature in college because I just didn't understand people. I just didn't understand why people did the things they did, why they acted the ways they acted, and why was I so weird? Everybody else seemed to just sort of go with the flow and then I declared an English major because I frankly just was not good at anything else. There was not much hope for me outside of literature. And so I took a class on 19th century British novels. And we started with Jane Austen and went up to the Brontes. So yesterday I had coffee with a student and we had a long conversation about Jane Eyre. And when Jane is able to break through to Rochester and has those famous lines that I won't be able to quote off the top of my head, but about we're not speaking, in the flesh, but more as from spirit to spirit, And so I just thought, oh, there's somebody who wants to go really deep. There's somebody who wants to go beneath the surface. And so that's how fiction works. It looks like reality in certain ways, but it also is more elevated and sort of feels these little harmonies in our lives. And I just became so addicted to that. So I'm not even talking about books that necessarily feature an autistic character or something. I'm just talking about good literature and good writing, good character development, good storytelling in general. Have moved me so much to become more self-aware and more thoughtful. And I think to go back to my first quote, more compassion. The exercise of the imagination is the training ground for compassion. Part of that. So I'll say that, and then I'll say one other thing, if it's okay, which is this. There's the old, I learned it from Toni Morrison, but I don't know where it originated, but there's the old idea that if you can't find the book you want to read, that you must write it. And so I did that with this book. I wanted a quirky literary book of essays about life and autism, not just focusing on church. And so I've been criticized for this. Some readers have said, oh, I wanted this more to be about church. The word faith is in the title. But it's my life, and that's an act of faith too. Is getting up and living every day and moving around the country and going to work and raising kids, doing all these things. So I wanted to write that book that I never saw. I saw a lot of decent books and I saw a lot of bad books, actually. Excuse me. When I began reading about autism, for example, I saw a lot of books that were not written from the autistic point of view. They were written from a clinical or research point of view, and sometimes spoke badly, I think, of autistic people, and it was kind of demeaning. And I said, I want something that's positive, but also realistic, realistic and deep and rich, and problematic, And so I tried to write the book that I couldn't find. And then the other thing is I've got a new one that I'm working on right now too, that's actually fiction. I'm super into young adult literature. I love coming of age stories about, that shift in your life usually in the, early to mid-teen years, from innocence to experience, as we say. And I couldn't find a really good coming of age young adult book written by an autistic person, which is key to me, to have that perspective, the so-called own voices, featuring an autistic protagonist. I just couldn't find that book, so I've written it, and I'm working with an illustrator right now up in Chicago, and we are proposing a graphic novel for young adults, for teens. And so I'm really excited because that lets me take my passions in a slightly different direction from this book. And my hope is that a lot of young readers will see themselves reflected in that book, just as some readers, thankfully, have seen themselves reflected in this book, in the nonfiction.
That's excuse me. That's great to hear that there's something new coming out. You must let us know when there are some details of that we can circulate. Quite a different genre to what we usually publicize at the centre, but that would be super. I wonder, you're saying you got some feedback about, why isn't this more about church? And now I feel rather self-conscious that our next few questions are all about church. But it is obviously a part of the book, and you've clearly made some points that have resonated with some of our sort of people who are following the webinar today. They relate both to sort of the positive aspect and the sort of harder aspects of church life. So we'll start with the positives. One questioner says, I quote your book nearly every time I teach on the subject of autism and faith. I love your story about how much you want to support the church's soup kitchen, but just can't cope with the sensory overwhelm involved with being on the team. Why does the church seem to have such an ableist model of a good Christian? Which means we all have to be sociable, tactile, pastorally intuitive, and high functioning in busy and noisy team environments. Tell me more about your gifts and how you share them in the global and the local church. So what ways round that problem have you found?
Wow. And again, that's just a really elegantly stated question. Yeah, it's tough because I can't do some of those things most weeks. Other times I will still force myself to do things if I think I have the spoons, so to speak, to pull it off. Then I may force myself into an area of discomfort to try to grow. If I know I can do it safely, and it's not going to cost me too much, then I might do that. But other times I've had to just decide, a couple things. For one thing, my church experience right now is just fantastic. I couldn't be more pleased. So I'm in a Episcopalian church, and our priest is just so thoughtful and so well read and so intelligent, and I'm just so grateful for her leadership in the past couple of years. And also the liturgy of the Episcopal liturgy is so calming and moving to me, and it's so important to me. The prayers of the people and the Book of Common Prayer and all the different things that we do. Before COVID, we took communion at the altar, and that was important to me because I go to church with university professors with PhDs, and I go to church with students who are 18, 19 years old, and people from the community who are experiencing housing and food insecurity in Grant County, Indiana. And all of us are there together at the foot of the cross, on our knees at the altar, and there's no difference between us at that point. And I appreciate that, and I love that model and that picture. So there's so many positives there. What can I do when I can't do the soup kitchen or other things? This book, I started out as a poet. That's my training and my background. So I published a book of poems back in 2012 that very few people ever read. And so that's my background. And this book, I had never done long form prose before in book form. And so this book was a kind of a test for me to say, God, if I can't do the soup kitchen, what can I do? If I can write and people respond to this and it gets some traction, then maybe that's going to be a bigger part of my ministry in the world in the future. I can do it in a very autistic way, by myself, in dim lighting, and then put the book out into the world and only do a couple events once in a while to say hi to people and try to answer some questions. But I can do the bulk of the work alone, and that's really meaningful to me. So that's what I've tried to do, is just sort of reposition my thinking around it and say, I think the traditional church, and especially here in Middle America, it's very much about shaking hands and smiling and all that stuff. I can't do a lot of it a lot of the time. And so I just said, well, what can I do? And then the global church is gonna have to live with whatever that answer is. And right now it's being a writer, I think, and being a teacher and being a dad and just doing the things that I normally do. Maybe I'll sign up to mow the lawn or something at the church, because that's a need also, and I can do it by myself.
That's super. I think to some extent you've also answered already the other question on this topic, which was sort of, how do you manage when, or in particular asking about sermons. I'll read it precisely rather than trying to summarize. As it relates to the church, being autistic and listening to sermons, how do you manage hearing something that feels unfinished or even cliched, but you know that you are frustrated or even panicking on the inside? This may be a fresh experience for the questioner, given how vivid that is. But do you ever experience that kind of, I guess, cognitive dissonance, I want to say?
Yeah, it's funny. Faith communities are funny because we're all at different places in our journeys, intellectually, emotionally, theologically, whatever. I don't really even possess the language to describe it accurately. Like my faith community where I work at the university, it's a Christian college, and so it's Christian liberal arts. It tends to be a more conservative place than where I'm at in my own life. My church tends to be much more of a liberal place. So there are many times when I'm hearing somebody speak, and yes, I will tend toward maybe dissociation because it doesn't add up to me. It's too crisp, it's too clean around the edges. What I'm hearing is maybe filled with empty phrases. Fortunately, I just have been on a journey over my life where I said, God, I know there's more to you than this. I refuse to go to a church that only gives me that, just these, crumbs. I want to be fed more than that. Can you lead me to a place where that can happen? And sure enough, like I said, my current minister is just a brilliant woman, and I'm on the edge of my seat for homilies every time I go, and I mean it. She knows I mean it. I tell her that, and I tell my friends that. So that's really rich and meaningful for me. If I was in a place where I couldn't have that, I wouldn't go. Bottom line. And I've been to churches that I just left after a while because I just thought, you know what? That's not where it's at for me right now. I need to grow in new ways, and it's not happening here. It's a stagnant place, or it's a place that represents a part of me from 20 years ago, but not today, So I don't have any, I'm fortunate that I don't have a whole lot of trouble with sermons. I do crawl out of my skin in other ways. I mean, this Saturday, I have our commencement ceremony at my university. There are going to be a lot of people leveling all sorts of cliched phrases from that stage for hours at a time, and it's going to be hot, and I'm going to need the restroom, and it's going to be uncomfortable, but I just go into those settings knowing that it's going to be a battle, and to survive is to win, and then I can come home and take a nap or do whatever I want, read a book. So yeah.
Great, thank you for that. I'm interested as well. You talk about earlier when you were talking about being in the Episcopal Church now, and that you found a home, not just with the higher quality preaching than what you've had before, but also with the liturgy. And one person comments, my son has non-speaking autism, can spell to communicate, and agrees that the Anglican liturgy is very calming and centering. I also noticed in my own interviews with autistic people in my own research that, so whereas you've spoken and one of your voices in the book speaks about the safety of rituals and routine, the safety of them, I had one participant speak about the beauty of ritual and routine, that it was aesthetically beautiful to be in that particular case in a Roman Catholic congregation where everybody moves as one, where it's all very neat and tidy. And that was not just safe, but beautiful. And I thought that was quite interesting. I wonder if you have any reflections on that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'm somebody who, I'm a bit of a misfit in the academy, I think, because I'm not a proper scholar. I'm an artist in the academy, and even my terminal degree is not a PhD, it's an MFA, which is a fine arts degree, it's a studio degree. What that indicates to people, or what it should indicate, some students don't care or don't know, but what it should indicate to students is I'm an artist in the academy, and that my output is probably never going to be critique or analysis of existing materials in terms of literature, but it in fact is going to be my own work, my own original work. So I'm going down that path just to say, as an artist, which is what I consider myself first and foremost, I'm all about beauty and feeling, and I'm a very deeply emotional person, especially sometimes for the expectations for a male, is that I would be a little more cerebral and less intense in terms of feelings, but I'm not. And so the beauty of participating in those services is a big deal for me. I love it. It's calming. It's soothing. It makes sense to me. I love to go to church when I can. I love to go 10, 15 minutes early and kneel on the kneelers, pull the kneeler down and kneel and have some silent prayer time before we even get started. And then usually the pianist will begin playing softly, and a melody will enter into the room, and that's a deeply rich and meaningful experience for me, and I think it shapes me in ways that I'll never understand. But it is calming, it's energizing and empowering. It does make me feel safe. It's the kind of thing that you want in your life to balance out those hard things. So, if you have to give a lecture and then you have a meeting afterward, and then there's a contentious issue on a committee that you're part of, you need to have that to be balanced by those routines and rituals, especially the faith-related ones for me, where I can give it to God and I can feel God's presence, so to speak, in that community and in that space and in that sacred space. It's deeply meaningful to me. It also, I suppose, there's a being an artist and being in love with beauty pushed me toward the so-called high church settings, because at least here in the States anyway, many of the evangelical churches I grew up with were, in strip malls and in little, let's say, very modest buildings, And then when I go to places like the UK and I see Canterbury Cathedral, or I see, Westminster Abbey or something like that, my inclination is to immediately want to go toward that side of things, the beauty that's in those spaces. And so, even just the age of our church and the dimensions of the church are really meaningful and powerful to me. I like to be in those settings physically.
Wait until you see King's College Chapel in Aberdeen. That's all I can say. You have to add that to your bucket list.
I can't wait. Absolutely.
Staying with this theme then of the way structures and routines and rituals can create beauty and safety, I've been looking for a good moment to slot this question in because it's rather a deep one. But you're not the first autistic person I've spoken to who has this real love of literature and stories and poems, and I find myself wondering about that. Is it something about the way that there are sort of structures is what the word I want, I think, embedded in these things, even though they purport to reflect real life as it is? And that then perhaps ties into this question that's come in. So the questioner writes, I love the way that you weave layers of story together, the layer of events and the layer of meaning as we seek to make sense of things. To what extent do you think that we all live in stories, even those who believe they are operating in an objective post-enlightenment world? That appears to sit well with the autistic need for certainty and system. Good luck. That's not an easy question.
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. Let's see. I think, when I teach world literature, which I get the chance to do like usually once a year, and it's in a very concentrated form, it's in our January term. So it's a 3.5 week, really deeply, intensely focused class in which I try to touch upon a great deal of literature from all around the world and every time period. I start with the Epic of Gilgamesh because it's, so far as we know, the oldest known story that we have. And I'm always interested in that. First of all, Gilgamesh is fascinating. If for people who've never read it, it's absolutely fascinating. It says a lot about friendship and the human condition and all kinds of other things. But what gets me about it is the ancient Mesopotamians, had invented these cuneiform characters and had developed the system of writing, and it's the first one that we know about. And when researchers look at some of these pieces of clay, with these cuneiform characters carved into them and baked, they realized that a lot of these were like business contracts. And so once people learned how to write, they said, okay, now I want something in writing so that I can get paid for the goods and services that I'm providing or whatever. Well, very shortly on the heels of learning how to write, we get the Epic of Gilgamesh. And it's a story, and it's a wild story, and it's about the clash of the divine and the human and all sorts of other things. And it just tells me, and then we look what we have right now here in the States, at least. The Marvel Cinematic Universe is very popular, and so people are watching all these shows about superheroes who have all kinds of powers and things like that. It is a way to provide structure, indeed. But I think, so my point about Gilgamesh coming at the very beginning was the moment we figured out how to write, we started telling stories. So it must be in our DNA somehow. It must just be baked into who we are, is the need to tell stories. Now, do most people understand that need? Probably not. I don't know that I do as well as I would like to, all the nuances of it. But I'm at least aware of it and kind of on the path toward understanding it. I think we all do subscribe to narratives that are larger than us, The Christian narrative, as far as I can see, is a narrative of fall and redemption. And it says in the end, everything's going to be okay. That's a big part of it. And so you can almost sort of live your life according to the truths that you believe from that narrative. As far as storytelling and structure, yes, it sort of purports to reflect reality in a way, but also it's always artifice, right? Poems and stories and plays and movies and TV shows are artifice, and we know that going in. That gives us the safety to unleash whatever ideas we want to explore, whatever fears we have. To go back to the Marilyn McIntyre quote at the beginning, she says stories call forth and focus our dread and desire. So sometimes I'll say to my students, I'm sorry, I'm rambling a little bit, but I'm trying to get around to an answer. I'll say to my students, Halloween is big here in the US, and I'll say to my students, how come around October you'll start seeing all these television commercials for very scary movies that include people with chainsaws running around, scaring teenagers and stuff? What's the deal with that? Why do we have this culturally? And my point is, life is scary. Life's very frightening a lot of the time, but we couldn't live in the white hot moment of that fear. So what we do is we package it in stories, and we even package it in within a certain month, and we say, okay, all the fears that we feel, let's just put them in October at the end of the month in the form of all these scary stories. And this has been going on forever in culture, and then that will call forth and focus our dread, and we'll scream together and laugh at ourselves together. And then we'll feel, Aristotle called it catharsis, obviously. We'll feel that sort of cleansing from the story. And then we'll leave the theater and go home and maybe not be as scared of life for the next couple of weeks. So yeah, there's a lot available to us psychologically in stories that I don't even understand, but I know that the power is there. And so I try to inhabit those spaces because I know it's making me better.
That's so fascinating. Thank you so much for that. So much to chew on there as well. Staying with then sort of the depth of what is there in stories, we've got a very practical question from someone who is a teacher in special education. I'm frequently confronted with students with autism having a lot of difficulties with comprehending the metaphors, so typically, I think, found in the Bible. Do you have recommendations for reading the Bible with young adults on the spectrum who really stumble with this problem?
Wow, what a wonderful question. I mean, I don't really have an answer to that, but it's because I've never considered it at all. It is true that to teach the Bible well, or to teach literature well, let's say you're in a language arts classroom in 6th or 7th grade or something like that, you do have to relay through many diverse examples what metaphor is and how it works. And moreover, if you want to take a step back, you have to relay what figurative language is and how it works, whether it's a metaphor or a simile or a hyperbole or some other sort of device that's used or technique that's used in writing. I think, it's funny because that gets us toward a place where a place that we sometimes make fun of or look down on or don't want to be, which is we'll read books with high school students and just point out all the figurative language. We'll say, read Huckleberry Finn and then write an essay about all of the figurative language that gets used. Pick 3 metaphors, 3 similes, and 3, something else. And it feels very silly and fake, and it turns people off to reading sometimes, and it's not great. But at the same time, it really does bring home the point that, look, there are techniques within the structures of writing, within the frameworks of storytelling, that you need to understand to have a meaningful experience with it. Now, the Bible is much, much tougher in terms of that, because what is metaphor and what's not? The second you say, well, the literal, 6-day creation, is that a metaphor, or is that a truth that we're supposed to, a scientific truth or something? Well, you're going to get all kinds of arguments from all sorts of people. It's very, very tough because people are so deeply invested in some of those things. And so to even understand it at all is very, very tough. I guess I would teach it alongside of stories and poems. I think I see a lot of value in reading the Bible with young people and young people on the spectrum alongside of reading children's books or reading watching cartoons. Cartoons are often very savvy and very smart, and are filled with figurative language and metaphor and stuff like that. So I think it's just a journey. And sometimes the good thing about most autistic people that I've found in my life is that they're really pretty smart, a lot of times above average. And so once they do get the concept and you say, that's a metaphor, do you understand it now? They'll be able to spot those patterns in places where you don't even see them anymore. So I think once you get over that hump, it could turn out to be good. But what a wonderful question. I don't have an answer, but I love to sit and think about that. That's great.
Super. We're coming towards the end of our time. But I feel like this last question is just a brilliant segue into you being able to talk about your new book that you're working on, your young adults fiction, possibly, and maybe some other things too. So as a teacher of young people, as someone who obviously has a heart for young people, what advice would you give to ASD, as it's put here, ASD teens or young adults who are struggling with loneliness, acceptance, and how this struggle is affecting their spiritual life, often with a deep wounding or an unmet longing for others and their care?
Yeah. Close to my heart. That is so close to who I am and who I want to be. And so I really, really appreciate that question. I don't know that I have a great answer again, but I'll try to talk through my thoughts anyway. Find community wherever you can find it. And when you find that community, whether it's online, I mean, I've met people on Twitter who have changed my life. You know, that's not really a plug for Twitter per se. It's just I just happen to be hanging around that particular space, and there are autistic folks on there saying really smart things, really insightful things, teaching me more about myself and who I am. Every aspect of things. There's so many comorbidities and co-occurring conditions and things like that. So to be in community with other autistic people, you'll be learning about yourself and about them and about how the world works, but also you'll feel safer because you'll have some of those same issues. People will have the same issues. If I say, oh, I contemplated ending my own life, I'm not going to get blank stares in a room full of autistic people. I'm going to get nodded heads being like, yeah, I have too. And once we get to that place where we can share our deepest shames and secrets, that's when we begin to heal, I think. So to young people, please find a group in person, find books that affirm you, who you are, whether you have an intersecting identity with lots of different components to it or whatever, and autism's one of those things. Find those books and find those spaces in person and also online where you can connect with others. I think that's just so absolutely critical. We cannot do this alone. And the other cool thing I'll say about that is you'd be surprised how well neurodivergent people take to one another. It's actually really, really exciting. And so because we're very intense on the whole. And so when you make an autistic friend and you feel like you've been misunderstood, you're 16, 17 years old, and you carry a lot of guilt and shame for not being good in the social spheres, but then you meet a fellow neurodivergent person and you talk about all those problems and stumbles that you've had. Generally, people take to each other so well under those circumstances and really can help lift each other up. So yeah, find community, find your people.
Sorry, Leon, you're on mute.
Sorry, I was on mute. Dan, thank you so much for this. And you were saying the last question was very close to your heart. Your answer was very close to my heart as well. It was very pastorally sensitive, and it's really about life, and it's about how we live life faithfully as individuals on the spectrum or as allies, and how we live as Christians, and how we live as a community, and how we care for each other, and how we can really recognize the gifts that we all have, and how we can together worship God in that sense. So thank you so much. You've touched on so many issues today. The questions were of great variety of topics, and I feel that reflects your book as well, because in your book you go in a lot of different ways, in the best sense of the word, I think. So thank you so much for being with us, for reading, for starting us with crisis, but also with storytelling, and storytelling as a way of making sense of life, really. So thank you. I'm not going to add much more to this because that would take away from the brilliant talk that you gave us and the brilliant answers to the questions. Thank you everyone for being here with us. Stay in touch with the Center for Autism and Theology, and I hope to see you next time. And I also want to thank Hannah very, very much for her wonderful moderating. Thank you so much.
Thanks. I just, it's such a joy to be here today. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you.